If you grew up anywhere in the Appalachian Mountains, you've probably heard at least one of these stories told around a kitchen table. Maybe your grandmother swore her people came over from Scotland or Ireland and never bowed to a king in their lives. Maybe your family talked about a German farmer who could make anything grow out of rock. Maybe somebody mentioned an English name that goes back before the Revolution. And almost certainly, somewhere in the family tree, there was a whispered story about a Cherokee ancestor, usually a woman, usually beautiful, usually mysterious. 4 bloods, 4 stories, 1 mountain range. And the wild part is, in Appalachia, there's a real chance all 4 of those stories are at least partly true. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Appalachia actually is. It isn't just a place, it's a corridor, a nearly 2,000-mile spine of ridges and hollows running from the southern tier of New York all the way down into Alabama and Georgia. For most of human history, it was one of the most isolating landscapes on the eastern half of the continent, a wall of folded rock that funneled people, forced them together, and then sealed them off from the outside world for generations at a time. That isolation is exactly why the ancestry of the region got frozen in place the way it did. Families that arrived in the 1700s often stayed on the same creek, in the same holler, for 200 years, which means the blood that settled there in the colonial era is still, in a very real sense, walking around today. So let's start at the beginning, with the people who were already there before any ship ever left Europe. Long before the word Appalachia existed, these mountains were Cherokee homeland. The Cherokee built their towns along rivers like the Tuckasegee, the Little Tennessee, and the Hiwassee, farming the fertile bottomland and hunting the ridges above. Their society was matrilineal, organized around clans passed down through the mother's line, with women holding real political and spiritual authority, something that later collided head-on with European assumptions about gender and power, and that collision is actually the root of one of the biggest myths we're going to get into later. For thousands of years, this was Cherokee country, not a wilderness waiting to be discovered, but a settled, cultivated, deeply known homeland. Then, starting in the 1600s and accelerating through the 1700s, 3 waves of European settlers began pouring into that same landscape from 3 very different directions, and for 3 very different reasons, and this is where the other 3 bloods enter the story. The first wave was English, and it's easy to forget just how far back it goes, because it starts before any of the others. In 1607, a small group of English colonists landed on a swampy peninsula in Virginia and founded Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Most of those original colonists were not farmers or frontiersmen. Many were gentlemen, younger sons of English landowners, merchants, adventurers looking for gold that never materialized. The colony nearly failed outright, saved only when John Rolfe figured out how to grow tobacco that Europeans would actually pay for. Tobacco changed everything. It exhausted the soil fast, which meant planters were constantly pushing further up the rivers looking for fresh land, and it created an economy that pulled English settlement steadily inland, out of the tidewater and into the Piedmont, and eventually right up against the wall of the Appalachian Mountains themselves. By the early 1700s, Virginia's colonial government was actively encouraging settlement of what they called the backcountry, the rugged land west of the Blue Ridge. Some of the people who pushed into that backcountry were English colonists themselves, often younger sons, who stood to inherit nothing under English inheritance law, and saw the frontier as their only shot at owning land. Others were indentured servants who had worked off their contracts and had nothing waiting for them back in the Tidewater aristocracy. English surnames run deep through Appalachian genealogy for exactly this reason. It's not the flashy story people usually reach for, but it's one of the oldest bloodlines in the mountains, stretching back to the very first English footprint in North America, and slowly, generation by generation, climbing into the hills. There's an important cultural split hiding inside that English story, too. The English who stayed in the Tidewater, the planter families building brick houses along the James and the York, developed a life that looked a lot like the English gentry back home, with Anglican churches, formal manners, and social hierarchies borrowed straight from the old country. The English who pushed inland, toward the fall line and then up into the Piedmont and the mountains, left almost all of that behind. They built log structures instead of brick manors, worshipped in plain meeting houses instead of formal parish churches. If they worshipped in any organized building at all, and adopted hunting, farming, and survival techniques learned directly from the native peoples they encountered along the way. Within a couple of generations, an English family that had climbed into the backcountry could look, sound, and live almost nothing like their Tidewater cousins 100 miles east. That divergence, wealthy coastal English versus rugged inland English, is part of why the English thread in Appalachian ancestry so often gets overshadowed by the more distinctly frontier cultures of the Scots-Irish and the Germans. The English were there from the start, but by the time the mountains were settled, many of them had been reshaped by the frontier into something that no longer looked particularly English at all. But English settlement alone didn't create the culture we now think of as Appalachian. That took 2 more waves, arriving almost side by side, down a single dirt road that became one of the most important migration routes in American history. That road was called the Great Wagon Road, and if you want to understand Appalachian ancestry, you basically have to understand this one road. It started as a Native American trading path, connecting trails used by the Iroquois in the north to paths used by the Cherokee further south. Colonial settlers adopted it and stretched it until it ran from Philadelphia down through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia and on into the Carolina Piedmont. And starting in the 1720s and 30s, 2 very different groups of immigrants began flooding down that road together, sharing the same route, the same hardships, and often the same neighborhoods, while still remaining, in most cases, culturally distinct from each other. The first of those groups is the one most people associate with Appalachia above all others, the Scots-Irish. The name is a little misleading because these people weren't a blend of Scottish and Irish blood in the way it sounds. They were, for the most part, Presbyterian Scots from the Scottish lowlands who had been relocated to the Northern Irish province of Ulster in the early 1600s as part of a deliberate English policy called the Plantation of Ulster. King James I wanted to break Gaelic Catholic power in Ireland and spread Protestantism at the same time, so land was seized from Irish landholders and handed over to Scottish and English settlers who worked it largely as tenant farmers. As many as 200,000 Scots crossed over during that period, and their descendants lived in Ulster for roughly a century before economic pressure, rising rents, and religious friction with both the English establishment and their Catholic Irish neighbors pushed them to cross the Atlantic in massive numbers. Between the early 1700s and the American Revolution, historians estimate that around 250,000 Ulster Scots made that crossing, most of them landing in Philadelphia. But Pennsylvania filled up fast, land got expensive, and these Ulster Presbyterians were, by most contemporaries, accounts, a restless, clannish, fiercely independent people who weren't especially interested in settling quietly under someone else's authority. So they turned south, down the Great Wagon Road, into the Shenandoah Valley, into the hills of western North Carolina, into Tennessee and Kentucky, chasing cheap land and distance from anyone who might try to tell them what to do. That instinct, more than almost anything else, is what shaped the Appalachian personality that people still talk about today. A deep suspicion of outside authority, a fierce loyalty to family and clan, a willingness to settle disputes personally rather than through official channels, and an entire musical tradition built on fiddle tunes and ballads carried straight over from the Scottish and Ulster countryside. Even the word hillbilly has roots tangled up in this history, tracing back to supporters of Protestant King William of Orange, who were nicknamed Billy Boys back in the Old Country. The Scots-Irish also carried something less musical with them, a border culture of retributive justice shaped by centuries of conflict along the Scottish-English frontier and then again in Ulster. Where an outside legal system couldn't be trusted, families settled their own disputes, and honor, loyalty to kin, and personal reputation mattered more than any courthouse. That tradition echoes all the way down to the most famous family feud in American folklore, the long, bloody dispute between the Hatfields of West Virginia and the McCoys of Kentucky, families of Scottish and English descent, whose conflict became a kind of shorthand for the whole idea of mountain justice. It's easy to romanticize or caricature that history and popular culture has done plenty of both. But underneath the stereotype is a real and coherent inheritance of people who had been pushed off their land by distant authorities twice already, in Scotland and then in Ireland, and who arrived in the Appalachian backcountry, determined that it wouldn't happen a third time. Walking that same road, often literally alongside the Scots-Irish, was the second great wave. German-speaking immigrants, mostly from the Rhineland-Palatinate region of what's now southwestern Germany, along with some Swiss and Alsatian Protestants fleeing religious persecution and repeated French military invasions of their homeland. In America, they became known a little confusingly as the Pennsylvania Dutch, which has nothing to do with the Netherlands at all. It's simply an English mangling of the word Deutsch, meaning German. By the mid-1700s, German immigrants made up such a large share of colonial settlement that in some regions they were outnumbered only by the English themselves. The Germans who came down the Great Wagon Road had a reputation, even among their contemporaries, for being methodical, industrious farmers who worked their land with an intensity that impressed and sometimes irritated their neighbors. One English observer at the time complained that Scots-Irish settlers, quote, not succeeding so well as the more frugal and industrious Germans kept selling their land to German buyers and pushing further into the frontier. That's not a knock on the Scots-Irish so much as it's a snapshot of two cultures with very different relationships to land and permanence, settling the same valleys at the same time. The Germans built the sturdy Conestoga wagons that hauled families and goods down that road in the first place. They brought distinctive architecture, distinctive farming techniques, and entire communities like the Moravians, who settled together, held property in common in some cases, and kept their language and customs alive in isolated valley pockets for generations. Even now, place names across the Shenandoah Valley and the Carolina Piedmont, things like Dutchman's Creek, are fossils of exactly where those German communities put down roots. Language kept many of these German communities distinct for far longer than you might expect. In some valley settlements, German or local dialect of it remained the language spoken at home, at church, and in the fields well into the 1800s, generations after the first wagons rolled down from Pennsylvania. That linguistic wall meant German and Scots-Irish families often lived only a few miles apart for a century or more while remaining largely separate socially, attending different churches, marrying within their own community, and passing down distinct customs, distinct architecture, even distinct approaches to something as basic as barn design. It's only in the later generations, as English became the dominant language of commerce and schooling across the backcountry, that these two founding populations really began to blend into each other at scale through marriage, trade, and simple proximity, until German surnames and Scots-Irish surnames sat side by side in the same church graveyards, the same militia rolls, and eventually the same family trees. So by the middle of the 1700s, you've got English families pushing inland from the Virginia Tidewater, Scots-Irish families pouring down from Pennsylvania looking for land and distance from authority, and German families pouring down that same road looking for good farmland to work with everything they had. All three of these groups were converging on mountains that were already Cherokee homeland, and that convergence did not happen peacefully. It happened through decades of conflict, broken treaties, and eventually one of the darkest chapters in American history. Before any of that convergence turned violent, it's worth sitting for a moment with what the Cherokee homeland actually looked like before European contact reshaped it. This wasn't scattered bands wandering in untouched wilderness. Cherokee society by the 1600s and 1700s included dozens of established towns, some with populations in the hundreds, organized political structures, extensive trade networks stretching across the southeast, and agricultural systems sophisticated enough to support that population density year after year in the same river valleys. European contact brought devastating epidemic disease long before it brought outright war, wiping out huge portions of the Cherokee population through smallpox and other illnesses their bodies had no prior exposure to, decades before the first major land conflicts even began. By the time English, Scots-Irish, and German settlers were pushing into the mountains in real numbers, the Cherokee nation had already been enduring more than a century of demographic catastrophe, diplomatic pressure, and shrinking territory, even as it remained, by any measure, one of the most powerful and organized native nations in the eastern half of the continent. Understanding that context matters, because it's the backdrop against which the final, most devastating chapter of forced removal took place. That chapter is the Trail of Tears. In 1830, the federal government passed the Indian Removal Act, and 5 years later, a small, unauthorized faction of Cherokee leaders signed a treaty at New Echota, Georgia, giving away the entire remaining Cherokee homeland east of the Mississippi in exchange for land out west and $5 million. Most of the Cherokee Nation never agreed to this. Principal Chief John Ross gathered more than 15,000 signatures on a petition asking the Senate to reject the treaty. The Senate ratified it anyway, by a single vote. In the fall and winter of 1838 and into 1839, roughly 16,000 Cherokee people were forced from their homes and marched, under military guard, more than 1,000 miles to what's now Oklahoma. An estimated quarter of them, somewhere around 4,000 people, died along the way from exposure, starvation, and disease. It is, without exaggeration, one of the great atrocities of American history. But not every Cherokee person walked that trail. A number of factors let a portion of the Cherokee population remain in the southern mountains. Some, particularly around a settlement called Quallatown, were legally exempt from removal because of an earlier treaty and land purchases made on their behalf by a white trader and adopted. Cherokee named William Holland Thomas. Others simply disappeared into the high, unmapped country of what's now the Great Smoky Mountains and evaded capture entirely, living for years as fugitives in their own homeland. One of the most famous of these was a man named Tsali, who was eventually captured and executed after killing soldiers pursuing his family, but whose sacrifice, according to the oral history passed down through his descendants, helped secure the government's grudging permission for a small remnant of Cherokee families to stay in North Carolina permanently. By 1868, the United States formally recognized this remaining population as a distinct tribe, the eastern band of the Cherokee Indians, and today their descendants still live on the Qualla boundary in western North Carolina, on land that includes some of the most sacred sites in Cherokee history, including a town called Kittiwah, considered the Cherokee mother town. Today, the eastern band operates its own government, its own schools, and its own economic institutions on the Qualla boundary, maintaining Cherokee language programs and cultural traditions that connect directly back to the people who refused to leave these mountains nearly 200 years ago. It's a living community, not a historical footnote. And that distinction matters enormously once you get into the next part of this story. So, there is a real, documented, unbroken line of Cherokee people who never left these mountains, whose descendants are still there right now. That's important to hold on to because it's very different from the fourth and final piece of this puzzle, which is the part almost everyone with Appalachian roots has personally run into, the family legend of Cherokee ancestry. If you spend even a little time in Appalachian genealogy circles, you'll notice the same story surfaces again and again in almost identical form, in family after family. Somewhere back a few generations, there was a great-great-grandmother, often described as having long dark hair and high cheekbones, who was supposedly a Cherokee princess. It's such a common story that genealogists and Cherokee scholars have a name for it, the Cherokee princess myth, and it has become something of a running joke and a source of real frustration within Cherokee communities themselves because it's used, whether people realize it or not, to lay a kind of borrowed claim to Indigenous identity without any of the lived history, community ties, or tribal citizenship that actually define it. Here's the thing that trips almost everyone up. There was no such thing as a Cherokee princess. It's simply not how Cherokee society worked. Cherokee towns were led by chiefs who were elected, not born into royal bloodlines, and Cherokee women held positions like beloved woman, an honored status earned through wisdom or wartime, courage, not inherited titles from a monarchy that never existed. The whole idea of a princess is a European projection, a way of forcing an unfamiliar matrilineal clan society into a framework Europeans already understood, kings and queens and princesses, and that framework got repeated so often in dime novels and Wild West shows and old genealogy books trying to sound impressive, that it hardened into a stock character passed down through thousands of unrelated American families. So why does the story show up so consistently? Genealogists who've spent years untangling these family legends have found a few recurring explanations. Sometimes it's a mistranslation or a coincidence, a family name that simply sounded exotic. Sometimes the word Cherokee was used, particularly in the South, as a softer, more socially acceptable way to describe a mixed-race ancestor whose actual heritage was African American at a time when acknowledging black ancestry could carry serious legal and social consequences. Sometimes it really was a case of intermarriage with an Indigenous woman from an entirely different tribe. But Cherokee got attached to the story later because Cherokee people were, in the racist hierarchy of the era, considered more assimilated and more socially acceptable to claim kinship with than other native nations. And sometimes the whole thing is simply invention, a flattering myth adopted because it made an ordinary farming family feel like they carried something wilder and more romantic in their blood. This is also where one of the strangest and most genuinely fascinating threads in Appalachian ancestry comes in. A group of people historically known as the Melungeons, concentrated for generations in the mountains where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina meet. The Melungeons were a community whose ancestry was mixed and, for a very long time, deeply mysterious, even to themselves. Family oral tradition held all kinds of origin stories, that they descended from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, from Turkish traders, from native people who had lived in those mountains since long before any European ever arrived. For generations, many Melungeon families genuinely believed and passed down as fact that their ancestry was Native American and Portuguese, in part because claiming those identities was safer under Southern race laws than acknowledging any African ancestry at all. Modern DNA research has told a more complicated and, honestly, more human story. Genetic studies conducted over the past couple of decades, cross-referencing Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA with historical records, found that many of the core Melungeon family lines actually descend from unions between sub-Saharan African men and European women, likely beginning among indentured servants in colonial Virginia in the 1600s, before slavery had hardened into the rigid, race-based system it later became. As laws tightened and interracial relationships became criminalized, these mixed heritage families migrated into the most isolated, hard-to-reach parts of the Appalachian frontier, precisely because isolation offered protection from a legal system that would otherwise have stripped away their freedom. Over generations, in the retelling, the true origin of that isolation got quietly replaced with softer, safer stories about Portuguese sailors and native princesses. Some of the researchers behind these studies have noted just how uncomfortable the real findings were for descendants who had built their identity around the older legends. But the actual history, once you sit with it, is arguably more remarkable than any of the myths. Entire. Communities of free and enslaved people of African, European, and yes, in many family lines, genuine Native American descent, who found a way to survive and build lasting communities in some of the most rugged terrain in eastern North America, by disappearing into the mountains and staying there for 200 years. All of which brings us to the question, people are usually really asking when they wonder whether they're Scots-Irish, German, Cherokee, or English. What does a DNA test actually tell you? There's also a broader cultural pattern behind why this particular myth attached itself so firmly to Appalachian families rather than fading out like most old folk stories do. Appalachia sat directly on the historical fault line where Cherokee territory and European settlement overlapped for the longest and most sustained period, which meant genuine intermarriage between settler families and Cherokee individuals absolutely did happen, especially in the earliest generations of contact and trade before removal hardened racial lines. That real history gave the later legend just enough plausibility to survive. A family with one authentic instance of intermarriage 3 or 4 generations back could tell that story for a century, and by the time it reached a grandchild's grandchild, a single real ancestor had often transformed, in the retelling, into royalty, into a princess, into something grander and more legible to a culture obsessed with pedigree and bloodline. The myth persisted because underneath the exaggeration, in a meaningful number of Appalachian families, there really was a kernel of truth worth remembering, just not the version that got passed down. Genetic ancestry testing has genuinely revolutionized how Appalachian families understand their own history, confirming European origins, sometimes revealing unexpected African or Native American segments, and occasionally shattering a cherished family myth completely, the way DNA testing has, in documented cases, revealed exactly 0 Native ancestry in families that had told the Cherokee princess story for 100 years. But it's worth understanding the limits of that testing too, especially when it comes to Native American ancestry specifically. There is no single genetic marker that says definitively this person is Cherokee. Consumer DNA companies estimate broad ancestral categories using population comparisons, and Native American tribes themselves, including the Cherokee Nation, have been consistently clear that tribal citizenship is a matter of political sovereignty and documented lineage, not a percentage on a spit-in-a-tube test. Result: a DNA test might suggest the possibility of Indigenous ancestry somewhere in your family tree. It cannot tell you which tribe, and it absolutely cannot make you a citizen of one. As Native scholars studying this exact issue have pointed out, genealogy and community connection tell a very different, and in some ways, much more meaningful story than a genetic percentage ever could. So where does that leave the 4 bloods of Appalachia, all these centuries later? It leaves a region built almost entirely out of collision and combination. English colonists pushing inland from the tidewater because primogeniture left them nothing at home. Ulster Scots pouring down the Great Wagon Road because they'd already been displaced once and weren't interested in being tenants twice. German farming families working the same road because Pennsylvania had gotten too crowded and too expensive, bringing an intensity of labor and craftsmanship that shaped the built landscape of the backcountry for generations. And underneath and around and eventually intertwined with all 3 of those waves, the Cherokee, whose homeland this always was, some of them forced 1,000 miles west on one of the darkest marches in American history, others hiding in these same ridges rather than leave, their descendants still here today, on the Qualla boundary, still Cherokee, still sovereign, still telling their own history in their own words. By the time you fold in the Melungeon communities, the African ancestry braided through so many Appalachian family trees, whether acknowledged or hidden, the English indentured servants working off contracts alongside enslaved and free black neighbors, you start to see that Appalachia was never the culturally uniform, isolated white mountain enclave that popular stereotype has painted it as for the last century. It was, from the very beginning, one of the most genetically and culturally blended regions in the entire country, forced into that blend by geography, by persecution, by poverty, and by the simple fact that people fleeing hardship in Ulster, in the Palatinate, in the Tidewater, and defending their homeland against removal, all ended up standing on the same ridgelines, drinking from the same creeks, and eventually, generation after generation, marrying into each other's families. So the next time somebody asks whether you're Scots-Irish, German, Cherokee, or English, the honest answer, if your people have been in these mountains for any real length of time, is probably not one of those. It's probably all of them, tangled together. Across 300 years, in proportions no family Bible and no DNA test can ever fully untangle. And maybe that's the real story of Appalachia. Not 4 separate bloods that happened to end up in the same mountains, but one people, forged out of all 4, who built something entirely new out of the wreckage in the hope that each of those groups carried up into these hills.